One of the most remarkable characters in all of the history of oceanography is Captain James Cook of the British Royal Navy. Interestingly, he was not well schooled. He wasn't the kind of person that you would, looking at him as a young man, believe would change the world peacefully more than any other person in history did. But he did.
The United States Exploring Expedition probably was the nucleus for much of marine science that occurred following this expedition. For instance, in the 1870s, the British mounted what was known as the Challenger Expedition, and it was a very, very successful expedition.
The outcome of that expedition was very uncertain, and yet the people who did it made the commitment to do it, and I think were quite heroic.
An oceanographic vessel today is essentially a floating lab, equipped with the latest computerized technology. It is capable of gathering data from the depths of the world ocean, then communicating with virtually any point, either on land or in the air. In stark contrast, the earliest attempts to explore the ocean were dangerous forays into a vast and unfamiliar world, led by heroic individuals with little more to guide them than insatiable curiosity and a sense of adventure. The earliest marine studies were driven by practical considerations: travel, trade, warfare, and the search for food. The Greeks were the first Europeans to venture beyond the sight of land, exploring the Atlantic Ocean between about 900 and 700 BC. Marine science, the systematic study of the ocean, began at the Library of Alexandria in Egypt, founded by Alexander the Great in the 3rd century BC. Meanwhile, the Polynesians continued their long-held tradition of oceanic voyages, eventually colonizing the Hawaiian Islands sometime between 450 and 600 AD. And in the centuries that followed, the Vikings of Scandinavia and the Chinese also made significant contributions to marine exploration. Finally, with the Age of Discovery, Renaissance Europeans set out to explore the world by sea. From Prince Henry the Navigator to Ferdinand Magellan, this was a time of profound change and enormous progress. But it was just the beginning. In 1768, a British scientific organization known as the Royal Society sent Naval Captain James Cook to Tahiti. Cook's mission was to measure the transit of Venus across the face of the sun, and in doing so, verify the gravitational laws of Sir Isaac Newton. Once he completed that assignment, Cook was told to return home, but it was suggested that he do a bit more exploring along the way.
So Cook takes off and goes over into the areas of the Great Barrier Reef. He discovers New Zealand. He goes around the world and eventually in 1771 ends up back home. But by the way, on the way, in the process of doing this, he can chart the positions of the objects he finds, can get back to the areas or tell other people to get back to the areas that he discovered, and gets back home in 1771 a hero.
In fact, the British government was so pleased with Cook's work that in 1772 it sent him back to the Pacific. His mission? To head towards the South Pole in search of an as-yet undiscovered continent that it was thought could possibly be in that region. When Cook returned to England in 1775, he had found evidence of such a continent, but hadn't actually reached what turned out to be Antarctica. He had, however, charted Tonga and Easter Islands, and discovered New Caledonia in the Pacific, and South Georgia in the Atlantic. He had also managed to circumnavigate the globe at the highest latitude ever. A scant year later, Cook was sent out a third time with his ships Resolution and Discovery.
And his goal on this trip is to find a passage across the north of North America from the Pacific to the Atlantic, the fabled Northwest Passage. So he goes into the Pacific, he goes around the bottom of South America from the Atlantic, goes into the Pacific, goes to some of his old haunts, goes straight up the center of the Pacific and discovers, or Western discovery, of Hawaii. The Spanish had gone back and forth across the Pacific to Manila and back, and they'd never seen Hawaii. Cook goes up the middle, finds Hawaii, makes friends of the locals, uses this as a staging area, goes up to the north and discovers a lot of places that we know of today. For example, Vancouver Island and Vancouver, BC are named after George Vancouver, who was a sailing master on one of the two ships. And he punches his way up into the Bering and Chukchi Seas, unable to find his way across the top, understandably, since that's always ice-choked. Well, he gives up, decides he has to get back home, goes back to Hawaii to provision and restage, and a little bit of a fracas dusts up between Cook and the locals. And on the 14th of February in 1779, Cook is killed.
Captain James Cook is well known for his oceanic exploration and scientific discoveries. What is not so well known about Cook is the kind of man he was. Perhaps most telling was the way he treated his crew.
He didn't beat them up, he didn't whip them. He was a good disciplinarian, but they respected him greatly, and he looked after them, and he included them in scientific work, in the collection of specimens, in understanding of how things work. He was an excellent diplomat. He made friends with people wherever he went. He was a person who, no matter what the language barrier, people instinctively liked. His leadership abilities were legendary. His commanders and lieutenants worshipped the ground he walked on. He was a singularly remarkable man.
As great as Captain Cook's contributions were, his 3 historic voyages were not purely scientific expeditions. He did his work as a representative of the British Crown, and part of what he did concerned foreign relations and other matters that pertained to the Royal Navy. It would be almost 100 years before the British would embark upon the first completely science-based marine expedition, in 1872. But prior to that, the United States set the stage for what was to come, with an exploring expedition launched in the late 1830s under the command of Lieutenant Charles Wilkes.
The United States exploring expedition originated under probably the most unusual circumstances of all time. In the early 1820s, a fellow by the name of John Cleves Symes, a former military officer and artilleryman, published a pamphlet saying that the United States needed a great philosopher like England had, and lacking somebody else, he named himself that person. In fact, he called himself the Newton of the West. And if you're going to be the Isaac Newton of the Western Hemisphere, you got to come up with something miraculous. What he came up with was a description of the world that he maintained was correct, that at each of the poles, the North and South Pole, there were holes. And if you sailed to the poles, you could actually sail inside the Earth through the holes. And because of the spinning of the Earth, you could sail around the inside of the Earth. And that when you got in there, you would find continents that were mirror images of the continents on the outside, peopled by races of people we didn't know about.
By 1838, nobody really believed there were holes in either the North or South Pole, but those in favor of an expedition that would include a polar component believed there were many other reasons to launch such a voyage. Not everyone agreed, however.
There was no tradition in the United States federal government for funding science. The only other scientific